we are dealing with complex numbers, which in general are imaginary numbers. I is an imaginary number. I, the basic building block of imaginaries, is that I is equal to the square root of -1. You cannot square root a negative value. That does not exist. So people decided to make it exist and call it I. The value of the square root of -1 is I. So what happens if I square I? Well, what's a square root squared? Well, doesn't that drop the square root off? Leaving you simply with -1. When you square a square root, it drops off, meaning the square root of -1 squared. Doesn't that mean the square dropped off the square root, leaving the -1 inside? Okay, what do you think I to the third would be? Well, isn't that just I times I squared? I to the third is I times I squared. So what's -1 times the square root of -1? It would be negative square root of -1. I to the third is I times I squared. Because isn't I to the first? You add the powers. So what do you think I to the fourth is? Well, isn't that just I squared times I squared? I to the fourth is I squared times I squared. So what's -1 times -1? Positive 1. I to the fifth? Well, isn't I to the fifth I to the fourth times I to the first? I to the fourth times I to the first is I to the fifth. So what's 1 times the square root of -1? Square root of -1. What would be I to the sixth? It's -1. This cycle repeats itself. When you get to the number 4, I to the fourth, everything after that repeats itself. So it goes from here, then it repeats, then it repeats. So every 4, it repeats itself. Over and over repeats. Something you'll see, there's a benchmark on this. We'll talk about it more in the future. Now, we cannot square root -25. But we can break it down into the square root of -1 times the square root of 25. And what's the square root of -1? That's I. What's the square root of 25? 5. Now, I don't like I-5, even though it's a highway. I want to put that 5I. Okay, number 2, right here. Square root of 50, -50 doesn't work, but I could change that to the square root of -1, the square root of 50, which doesn't that now make I square root 50? But does 50 square root reduce? Yeah. Isn't that the square root of 25 times the square root of 2? So could I actually write my answer as, isn't that 5? Yeah. So wouldn't it be I times 5 square root 2? I times 5 square root 2? Which, instead of put I5, can we make that 5I square root 2? Again, I, whenever you see an I, it equals the square root of -1. Just like whenever you see the letter pi, the symbol pi, it means 3.14. A whole bunch of numbers. I equals a number. It also means you're dealing with imaginaries. Here are 2 imaginary numbers. Imaginaries deal with imaginary parts and real parts. Together it's an imaginary. We are going to subtract these imaginaries. It's pathetically easy. All we're going to do is combine like terms. This becomes 3 minus 2i plus, don't you just change the signs? For a minus, don't you just make that a plus and change these 2 signs? And then can you combine like terms? As simple as, what's 3 plus 7? 10. And what's negative 2i and negative 4i? Here's your answer. Just realize the I has a value of square root -1, but all we're doing is combining like terms. Whenever you add or subtract imaginaries, you're just combining like terms. That's it. Here, we are multiplying imaginaries. Again, treat I like a variable. How do you multiply things like this? It's FOIL. First, you multiply these two. You get -15. Then you multiply these two. You get 12i. Then you multiply these two. You get positive 5i. And then you multiply these two. And you get -4i squared. When we put that all together, you get -15. These two combine to be 17i minus 4. What's I squared equal? What do we say right here? Does I squared equal -1? So can I replace my I squared with -1? So now can we combine these two? Doesn't that become a positive 4? Positive 4 and -15 is -11 plus 17i. So we did FOIL. We replace I squared with -1. Then we combine these two front and back numbers. There's your answer. Multiply, FOIL. Just when you get I squareds, replace I squared with -1. Okay. Number 5. Well, -5i squared. Well, that just basically means -5i times -5i. So what's -5 times -5? Well, isn't -5 times -5 simply 25? And what's I times I? I squared? Well, what's I squared? Isn't I squared -1? So 25 times -1 is -25. Now, this one's quite a bit different. Number 6, we're dividing a real number by an imaginary. And here's the process. Basically, you do not want an imaginary on the bottom. And the process is simply this. If I multiply top and bottom by 7i, watch what happens. If I multiply top and bottom by 7i, because you don't want imaginaries on the bottom. It's just kind of rule-ish. Anyways, that becomes 21i on top. And the bottom, doesn't that become 49i squared? What's I squared? Doesn't that become 21i over 49 times -1? So my answer is going to be -21i over 49. Did I move my I from the bottom to the top? Now what you have to learn to do is, how do you get that to the top? You take the bottom and multiply top and bottom by it. You got to think about, what do I got to do to get rid of the I on the bottom? And the way to get rid of an I is multiply by an I. It'll come with practice.